is still unclear tonight. Lee was convicted in 1998 for a double murder in Dallas County. It happened during a robbery at this pawn shop near Orrville. His attorneys argue that Lee should not be put to death at all because the jury in his case originally sentenced him to life in prison. That sentence was later upgraded by the judge, a process that's now no longer legal in the state.
You still just got to maintain your focus to continue to fight this.
Lee says despite his crimes, no matter what happens, he believes he will find redemption in heaven.
I'm not scared to die. I don't fear dying or nothing like that because I know where I will be. I am not finished. And just, to me, my faith is everything. And I'm emotional right now.
On the night of June 11th, 2026, the state of Alabama prepared to execute a man named Jeffery James Lee inside the William C. Holman Correctional Facility in Atmore, Alabama. The method was nitrogen hypoxia, a gas mask strapped to the face, pure nitrogen pumped in, and oxygen slowly taken away until the person on the gurney stops breathing. It was scheduled for 6 p.m. But it never happened. A federal court had ruled just 2 days earlier that Alabama's nitrogen gas protocol would cause something called air hunger, sustained periods of oxygen deprivation that would expose Lee to 1 to 3 full minutes of intense psychological and physical suffering before he lost consciousness. The court said that was unconstitutional. Alabama appealed. The 11th Circuit upheld the ruling. Alabama appealed again, all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court on the day of the scheduled execution. At 9:17 p.m. on June 11, 2026, 3 hours after the execution should have begun, the U.S. Supreme Court denied Alabama's appeal. Jeffery Lee was not executed. But here is what makes this story unlike almost any other on this channel. The jury at Jeffery Lee's trial voted 7-5 to sentence him to life in prison without parole. Not death, but life imprisonment. 7 of the 12 people who heard every piece of evidence decided he should not die. But the trial judge overrode that jury vote and sentenced him to death anyway. Under a practice called judicial override, a practice Alabama abolished in 2017 for all future cases, one judge overruled 12 citizens. That was in the year 2000. Jeffery Lee has been on death row for 26 years for a sentence his own jury never voted for. This is the full story of what happened on December 12, 1998 at Jimmy's Pawnshop in Orrville, Alabama, and everything that followed. If you are new to this channel, support us. Like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell. New videos like this drop every week. On June 11, 2026, the state of Alabama attempted to execute Jeffery James Lee for the 1998 murders of Jimmy Ellis and Elaine Thompson at Jimmy's Pawnshop in Orrville. They failed. Not because the execution was botched, but because the court said the method itself was unconstitutional. But before we get to any of that, you need to know who Jimmy Ellis actually was. Because Jimmy Ellis was not just a pawnshop owner. He was one of the most extraordinary musicians in the history of Alabama. And the story of his life is as strange and remarkable as the story of his death. Jimmy Ellis was born James Hughes Bell on February 26, 1945, in Alabama. When he was 2 years old, he moved with his mother to Birmingham, Alabama, where he was put up for adoption. He was 4 years old when he was adopted by R.F. and Mary Faye Ellis, who gave him the name he would carry for the rest of his life. He attended Orrville High School. He excelled at baseball, football, and basketball. And then one day, he stood up in the school talent show and sang, and nobody in that room was quite prepared for what they heard. Because Jimmy Ellis had a voice that sounded almost exactly like Elvis Presley. Not a little bit like Elvis. Not close enough to, but exactly like Elvis, in tone, in texture, in every inflection. And in 1962, he took that voice to a statewide talent contest and won it. He won $1,000 and an appearance on television's Ted Mack Amateur Hour. And in case you're wondering who Elvis Presley is, and how popular he might be in the 1950s, he is a rock and roll superstar who became so wildly famous he caused global fan hysteria, dominated the music charts with 18 #1 hits, and left behind a legacy so massive that millions believed he faked his own 1977 death just to escape the fame. Because his death happened so suddenly and behind closed doors, a massive wave of conspiracy theories exploded. For decades, many fans clung to a wild belief that Elvis is alive, with many believing that he faked his own death to escape the suffocating pressure of his massive fame and go live a quiet, normal life. This belief grew so popular that there were thousands of alleged Elvis sightings reported at grocery stores, gas stations, and restaurants all over America. Fans pointed out weird details, like a misspelled middle name on his tombstone, and a life insurance policy that was never cashed, as proof he was still out there. It became a permanent pop culture joke, with tabloids constantly running headlines claiming he was hiding out. In reality, medical records and family accounts confirmed he had passed away, but the myth proved just how impossible it was for people to believe that the larger-than-life king of rock and roll could actually be gone. Over the years that followed, Jimmy Ellis recorded albums for Sun Records, the same label that had launched Elvis himself. Since his voice was remarkably similar to Elvis Presley's, a fact which he and his record company played upon, leading some to believe that some of his recordings were actually by Presley himself. Jimmy Ellis, known as Orion, or should I say Elvis Presley Impersonator, toured with Loretta Lynn, Jerry Lee Lewis, Tammy Wynette, Ricky Skaggs, the Oak Ridge Boys, and Dionne Warwick, making his fan club numbered in the thousands. He performed under the stage name Orion, wearing a mask, because his record company leaned into the mystery, letting audiences wonder whether they were hearing a tribute act or something more extraordinary. Since some people genuinely believed that Elvis had not died in 1977, that he had faked his death to escape the pressure of fame, and that he had returned, masked, unannounced, as Orion, Jimmy Ellis spent years trying to escape that shadow, until he tore off the mask on stage in 1983 and announced he would not wear it again. But without the mystique, the bookings dried up and he went back to zero. But in 1987, he'd put the mask back on and went back on the road, but the booking wasn't coming like before. By 1998, Jimmy Ellis had stepped back from the stage and returned to his roots in Orrville, running his own pawnshop, Jimmy's Pawn and Package Store, a small store in a small town in Dallas County. He was 53 years old, and was running it alongside his ex-wife, Elaine Thompson, and their employee Helen King. He was standing before the display counter in his shop just one afternoon on Saturday, December 12, 1998, when the gunman burst in and, in seconds, turned the quiet shop into a slaughterhouse. Jeffery James Lee has not been executed for the crime he committed in 1998, when he was 21 years old. The robbery and shooting deaths of Jimmy Ellis and Elaine Thompson, and the attempted murder of Helen King, at Jimmy's Pawnshop in Orrville, Alabama on December 12, 1998. Jeffery James Lee was born in 1977 in Plantersville, Alabama, a community in Dallas County, one of the poorest counties in one of the poorest states in America. He grew up in chronic poverty. He could not read above a second-grade level. By the time December 12, 1998 arrived, Lee was 21 years old. He had a girlfriend he wanted to buy a ring for. He had a son who was just 2 months old. By every outward account, Lee was a young man from a hard place with very few resources and very little direction. But on the morning of December 12, 1998, Jeffery Lee had not slept. He had been awake all night, drinking alcohol, smoking marijuana, and ingesting cocaine. By the time Saturday afternoon arrived, his body and his mind were running on a combination of substances that would have impaired any person's judgment, let alone a 21-year-old with a second-grade reading level and no structure holding his life together. At some point that morning, Lee decided to go to Jimmy's Pawnshop in Orrville. He went with his brother, and his cousin. The reason he gave for wanting to go was that he wanted to look at wedding rings for his girlfriend. They walked into the store together. Helen King was behind the counter. Lee spoke with her directly. He asked to see the wedding rings that were available. He looked at what they had. And then he told her he did not have money on him right now, but that he would go and get money from his grandmother and come back. He left the store. He purchased a pint of liquor outside. Then he and his brother and cousin drove a short distance away from the pawnshop. And there, in the car, Lee drank the liquor and smoked more marijuana laced with cocaine. Minutes later he went back. With a sawed-off shotgun. He walked through the front door of Jimmy's pawnshop at around noon on December 12, 1998. He yelled, "What's up, motherfuckers?" He raised the shotgun and fired immediately at Jimmy Ellis. The blast hit Ellis in the arm first. After the first shot, Ellis, 53 years old, mortally wounded, began crawling along the floor, trying to find shelter behind a computer desk. He was looking for somewhere to hide from the man who had just shot him in his own store. Lee turned the weapon on Elaine Thompson. She was on a stool behind the counter. He fired once into her face. She was killed instantly. He then shot Helen King in the hand. She fell to the floor and went completely still. She did not make a sound. She lay there and did not move. Lee turned back toward Jimmy Ellis, still crawling, still trying to find cover, and fired at him again. Twice. The second shot caught Ellis as he struggled behind the computer desk. Jimmy Ellis, the man who had toured with Jerry Lee Lewis and the Oak Ridge Boys, who had worn a mask and made audiences wonder if Elvis was still alive, died on the floor of his own pawnshop in Orrville, Alabama. Lee then moved toward the cash register. He knocked it off the counter. He could not open it. It was secured, wired to the structure of the counter, and no amount of force was going to open it. He left the shotgun on the counter and walked out of the store with his brother and cousin and drove away. He had walked into that store with a weapon, shot 3 people, killed 2 of them, and walked out with nothing. Not the cash register. Not the jewelry. Not a single dollar. He left $900 in the pocket of Jimmy Ellis, which made the murder suspicious and not robbery or theft. The entire thing had been captured on the store's surveillance camera. Every second of it. There was a large television monitor at the entrance of the store, the kind of setup that lets customers see themselves as they walk in, a visible reminder that recording is in progress. Lee had walked past it. Helen King, still lying on the floor pretending to be dead, waited until the car drove away. Then she got up, called 911, walked to the front doors and locked them. Moments later, Lee and the others apparently returned to retrieve their gun and tried to get back inside. The doors were locked. Lee tried to open it several times, but it didn't open. So they drove away for the last time. Lee and his brother and cousin drove to Georgia. They rented a motel room in Noonan, in Coweta County. Later that day, Lee's brother and cousin separated from him, drove back to Alabama, and told law enforcement what had happened. At approximately 4:30 a.m. on December 13, 1998, less than 17 hours after the shooting, law enforcement officers found Jeffery Lee in that Coweta County motel room and arrested him. He signed a written confession shortly after his arrest. In the confession, he wrote that the first shot fired at Ellis had been accidental. He admitted that everything that followed was intentional. The investigation was swift and comprehensive, because the evidence was overwhelming before investigators had even spoken to a single witness. The surveillance camera inside Jimmy's pawnshop had recorded everything. Every shot. Every movement. The faces of the people in that store. The entire sequence of events from the moment Lee walked through the door until the moment he walked back out. It was all there on tape. Helen King had survived and was able to give a detailed first-hand account of everything she had witnessed before going to the floor. She had seen Lee's face. She had spoken with him earlier in the day about wedding rings. She knew exactly what he looked like and exactly what he had done. On March 7, 1999, Jeffery James Lee was indicted on 2 counts of capital murder and 1 count of attempted murder. The surveillance video, the same footage he had walked past when entering the store, sat in evidence, ready to be shown to a jury. The trial took place in Dallas County, Alabama in the year 2000. Dallas County is in Alabama's Black Belt, a region with a long and documented history of racial injustice. Jeffery Lee is black. Jimmy Ellis, Elaine Thompson, and Helen King were all white. And the prosecutor, during jury selection, used all 21 of his peremptory strikes against black prospective jurors. Every single one. All against black potential jurors. Not one was left on the jury to hear this case involving a black defendant accused of killing white victims in Dallas County, Alabama. Lee could not afford a lawyer. His court-appointed attorney had never tried a capital case before in his life. According to court filings, that attorney did almost nothing to prepare for the trial. The defense argued at trial that Lee had intellectual disabilities, that he functioned at a second-grade reading level, that his mind was not capable of the kind of rational calculation prosecutors were attributing to him. They pointed out the obvious question. Why would a man who had just watched himself walk past a visible surveillance camera proceed to shoot 3 people inside a monitored store? Why would he leave $900 in the pocket of the man he had just shot? Why would he leave without taking a single piece of jewelry? Why would he leave the cash register, the only thing he had come for, sitting on the floor unopened? The prosecutor's answer to all of those questions was simple. The jury should keep the mental retardation claim in mind throughout, and it would explain what happened. He essentially argued that Lee's intellectual disability explained the incoherence of the crime, not that it excused it. The jury convicted Lee of 2 counts of capital murder and 1 count of attempted murder. Then came the sentencing phase. The jury deliberated. And when they came back with their recommendation, it was this. 7 jurors voted to sentence Jeffery Lee to life in prison without the possibility of parole. 5 voted for death. 7-5. A majority of the jury, the 12 citizens of Dallas County who had heard every piece of evidence, said this man should live. Under Alabama law at the time, that vote was only a recommendation. The final decision belonged to the trial judge. And on October 11, 2000, the judge chose death. He overrode the jury's recommendation and imposed the death penalty on a man whose own jury had voted for life. This practice, called judicial override, was abolished by Alabama in 2017 for all future cases. But for the cases that had already been sentenced under it, the sentences stood. Jeffery Lee was one of them. He was 23 years old when he was sent to death row. Following his 2000 sentencing, Jeffery James Lee was sent to the William C. Holman Correctional Facility in Atmore, Alabama, Alabama's death row. He would spend the next 26 years there. In those 26 years, Lee changed. By his own account, the first years were the darkest. He told CNN in a phone interview from Holman in the days before his scheduled execution. I had made the worst mistake a person could make, and so for years I struggled with suicidal thoughts. He said he spent a long time unable to face what he had done. Even now, he said, it's hard for me to accept that I was capable of something like that. But eventually he found faith. He became a Christian. He took on leadership roles within the prison, as a preacher, as a church teacher, and ultimately as a chaplain and a leader in the Kairos ministry, a faith-based prison outreach program. People who have worked with him inside Holman describe him as a man who has genuinely transformed, someone who now spends his days serving the people around him rather than thinking about himself. He has a son. That son was 2 months old at the time of Lee's arrest. He is now 28 years old. Lee told CNN he has not yet been able to bring himself to make all the calls he needs to make, to his parents, his siblings, and his son, before the end. In April 2026, Governor Kay Ivey set the execution window, a 30-hour period beginning at midnight on June 11, 2026, ending at 6 a.m. on June 12. The tentative execution time was 6 p.m. on June 11. The method, nitrogen hypoxia, the same controversial method Alabama had pioneered in January 2024, when it became the first state in American history to execute someone by making them breathe pure nitrogen gas through an industrial-grade mask strapped to their face. Witnesses to previous nitrogen executions in Alabama had described the condemned person shaking violently on the gurney, struggling against restraints, and gasping for air. The American Thoracic Society filed a brief stating that nitrogen hypoxia executions cause intense, inhumane suffering. Lee's attorneys argued that the method would expose him to what medical professionals call air hunger, the deeply distressing sensation of desperate need for oxygen, for 1 to 3 full minutes before he lost consciousness. They proposed an alternative, death by firing squad, which they argued would kill him in seconds and cause significantly less suffering, but the state of Alabama doesn't have a setup for firing squad. On June 9, 2026, 2 days before the scheduled execution, a federal district judge permanently ordered the state of Alabama from using nitrogen gas to execute Jeffery Lee. The judge agreed that the nitrogen protocol exposed Lee to an unconstitutional level of suffering. The 11th Circuit Court of Appeals upheld that ruling 2-1. Alabama's Attorney General Steve Marshall appealed immediately to the U.S. Supreme Court. The execution window opened at midnight on June 11, 2026. The 6 p.m. execution time came and went. The appeals were still moving through the Supreme Court. And then, at 9:17 p.m. on June 11, 2026, the U.S. Supreme Court issued its ruling. The court denied Alabama's appeal. Jeffery James Lee would not be executed that night. On the morning of June 11, 2026, Jeffery James Lee was inside the Holman Correctional Facility in Atmore, Alabama, waiting to find out if he was going to die that evening. Governor Kay Ivey had already issued her statement. She was not going to intervene. Attorney General Steve Marshall had said the courts must allow the execution to proceed, evoking the memories of Jimmy Ellis and Elaine Thompson. "Those victims are the people I keep in mind," he said. As the evening progressed, the legal battle moved at extraordinary speed. The 11th Circuit ruled. Alabama appealed. The Supreme Court received the emergency filing. Justices reviewed the arguments. Outside the Holman Correctional Facility, people gathered. Some in support of the execution. Others opposed, holding signs bearing witness. Inside, Lee waited. And at about 9:17 p.m. on June 11, 2026, the U.S. Supreme Court declined to intervene. Alabama's attempt to use nitrogen gas to execute Jeffery Lee was over, at least for now. Governor Ivey released a statement expressing disappointment. She said she remains committed to ensuring that justice is ultimately served for Jimmy Ellis and Elaine Thompson. Attorney General Steve Marshall said the ruling was a miscarriage of justice, not for us, but for Jimmy Ellis and Elaine Thompson, who Jeffery Lee brutally and senselessly murdered and left on the floor of their place of business. He added that he wants their families to know that we will never stop seeking justice for Jimmy and Elaine. The state of Alabama can still reschedule Lee's execution using a different method. How quickly they will make that decision and give him a new execution date, and what method they will choose, remains to be seen. Jeffery James Lee is still alive. He is 49 years old. He is a prison chaplain who leads church services and counsels other inmates. He has spent 26 years on death row for a sentence that 7 of his 12 jurors voted against. Here is the question this case leaves behind. A jury of 12 people heard everything. They convicted Jeffery Lee. They agreed he was guilty of murder. And then 7 of them said, "Let him live." 5 said, "He should die." and a single judge decided the 5 were right and the 7 were wrong. Is that justice? And is the man who walks the halls of Holman as a prison chaplain today the same man who walked into Jimmy's pawnshop with a sawed-off shotgun in 1998? Can a person become someone different enough that the sentence given to who they were no longer fits who they are? Or does what happened to Jimmy Ellis and Elaine Thompson on that Saturday afternoon mean that none of that matters? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story stayed with you, share it, like it, and subscribe. Because every story on this channel is about a real person. And every real person deserves to have their story told in full. If you're a lover of creepy true crime stories, true crime documentaries, horror crime, unsolved mysteries, and the rest, you can do well to check out our twin channel Mysterious Dark Files for more videos like that.